Hi everybody, good afternoon. My name is Blair. I'm NYPIRG's Executive Director. Thank you for coming. We have working on an important issue. Just want to make sure everybody who's in the media has a copy of the press packet. It should be a packet. You have a copy of the release. If you don't have it, Stacy can bring some over. So if people need some down here, Stacy, you can just walk down and give it to them. Because I'm just rambling, and so for now it's fine in terms of them. We're not going to use this part, I hope. Again, good afternoon. We're here today to work to advocate for an issue of importance not only in New York, the nation, but also the world. And it's the problem of the growing threat posed by antibiotic-resistant so-called superbugs. Now, a lot of people here are going to go through this in more detail. I'm just really my job is to set it up. The reason we're talking about it this week is the governor has in his health budget language that requires the creation of stewardship programs in hospitals and nursing homes to deal with the growing threat of antibiotic-resistant microbes. So it's critically important. The world's experts say that more people could die from antibiotic-resistant infections than cancer by the middle of this century. This is a critical issue for a public health issue. One problem with the governor's proposal is that it doesn't deal with a huge percentage, a significant percentage, of the antibiotic-resistant infections that occur. According to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, about 20% of all antibiotic-resistant microbes come from farm settings. And what we'll be pushing today is legislation to deal with that. The sponsors are here to my left, your right, is Senator Brian Kavanagh, who's the sponsor in the Senate. To my right, your left, Assemblywoman Linda Rosenthal, who has introduced the bill in the Assembly. I will turn it over to Senator Kavanagh, and then we will move through the rest of the speakers before we have your questions. Thank you. Senator?
Thank you, Blair, and NYPIRG and Consumer Reports, and a great champion in the Assembly, Linda Rosenthal, a champion of on this issue and so many other things that are really important to all New Yorkers. This is really an apt time to be talking about this, partly, as Blair noted, because the governor has added to his budget some language that's intended to address one aspect of the growing threat of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which is to say in healthcare settings. And that's very important in human health, and we applaud the governor for addressing that. But it's also very, very critical that we address the fact that a lot of the threat that we're dealing with comes from farm practices where people have used, over time, the industry has used antibiotics in ways that go well beyond treating illnesses that are found in the animals. And so there's been a long-standing practice in various parts of the world of using antibiotics as a way of just increasing the yield from animals. There has been some effort on the federal level and on the state level to address that, but there remain gaps in the law. The one that this bill deals with particularly is the use of antibiotics to prevent disease. Now, I think that people have become more aware that there is a downside to just taking antibiotics routinely, even when we're sick. I think people understand that you shouldn't just be taking antibiotics anytime you have an ordinary cold or an ordinary illness, because of this concern that over time they will become less effective. We certainly wouldn't, in human health, take the step of just deciding, I think it's flu season, I'll take antibiotics every day just to prevent some possible illness that I might get. We understand that these things are critical and they are about treating illnesses when they arise, not prevention. And yet, in the agriculture community, there is still too much and too broad use of these things in a way that will negatively affect their impact. And just to be clear, what we're talking about is medicines that are similar to or identical to the medicines that we're using for human beings. So what we're doing is creating basically we're creating a situation where over time we're incubating bugs, bacteria that will be resistant to our treatment. I mentioned before that it's an apt time to argue this because of the governor's action, but the other reason I think is because we're dealing on a global basis with the new coronavirus. And that is something that I think has gotten people aware of the need to have effective tools for disease prevention. Now, it's a very different context. It's a virus, and it's something that is new to human health, but we are seeing in real time the danger of a communicable illness that we don't have the tools to address, and we are racing against time now to contain that and to develop the means of treating it, and hopefully the means of inoculating people against it. And yet at the same time, in other quarters, we're diminishing the value of the treatments that have been tried and true over many years for existing kinds of illnesses that we've seen before. And so as bacteria are going to evolve, our treatments are going to become less effective, and we're going to see more and more public health crises. So it's critical that we address this, critical that we address it this session. And again, I thank so many people who have worked on this issue to get the word out, to educate people, and hopefully to push to get real legislative action this session. Thank you.
Senator Kavanagh, it's exciting to be doing this legislation with you because I know how determined and committed you are to doing the right thing. And in this case, this is the right thing. It's the right thing for animals. It's the right thing for human beings as well. You know, here's a little scary food for thought. By 2050, roughly 10 million people will die worldwide from antibiotic-resistant infections. And part of the reason is because humans take far too many antibiotics, and animals are given far too many antibiotics when they don't need them. Also, some of the cattle that turns into a burger on your plate, not mine, but some people's, is from an animal that was raised in filth. The conditions are less than ideal. So to prevent infection, they're given antibiotics. But, you know, that is unnecessary. There are times when it's necessary, but for the most part, it's unnecessary, and the resultant action is less effectiveness of antibiotics, and that is a very scary notion. You know, humans too often are told, well, you might have the flu, you might not, but take antibiotics just as a precaution. And that has helped weaken the antibiotics effectiveness. Same thing with animals. And yes, coronavirus is out there scaring everyone, but we need to have the medical tools to fight viruses like that and others. And so this bill will put a stop to the indiscriminate use of antibiotics in animals. And we're not going to let the superbugs prosper and spread, but that will continue happening if we don't pass this legislation into law. Senator Kavanagh and I are determined to do just that, and we are joined with a cadre of scientists and doctors who've researched this deeply, and they're going to present the scientific side to bolster our advocacy. So, please introduce yourself.
Hi. So, thank you to Senator Kavanagh and to Assemblymember Rosenthal for your leadership with this bill. My name is Saul Hymes. I am a pediatric infectious disease specialist and medical director of Pediatric Antimicrobial Stewardship at Stony Brook Children's Hospital on Long Island. I'm an assistant professor of clinical pediatrics at Stony Brook University School of Medicine, and I'm also on the New York State Task Force on Antimicrobial Resistance and Stewardship, out of which have come many of, both on the human and animal side, recommendations about antibiotic use. And it's in these roles that I see every day what antibiotic resistance means and what it will mean if we don't take urgent action to stop it. So just to review a bit, antibiotic resistance is pretty straightforward. Every single time any bacteria is exposed to an antibiotic, whether we take it or an animal takes it, every single dose, some of the bacteria in that animal or person are going to become resistant to that drug. It's the same selective breeding that let us turn wolves into dogs or wildcats into kittens at home. And it's not new. We've been inadvertently breeding these superbugs ever since antibiotics have been discovered. Alexander Fleming warned about it in the 1940s. He knew, we've known what was coming for 80 years or more. And so what is coming? People talk about the post-antibiotic era. Unfortunately, forget it's coming. I mean, the CDC says this, but as a practitioner, I'm here to tell you also, it's here. We are in the post-antibiotic era now, today. It's still early. People sometimes wonder what keeps doctors up at night. A lot of times, the past couple of weeks, people have asked me, am I worried about the coronavirus? I'm actually not that worried about the coronavirus. I'm worried about this. This is what scares me. My daughter just recently had a strep infection, turned out to have a drug reaction to amoxicillin, so she now is on second-line antibiotics, a lot of which strep is resistant to. So this is a real threat. The latest CDC data shows that 2.8 million people are sickened and 35,000 die each year from antimicrobial resistant infections. So those are big numbers, but to put that in perspective in terms of deaths, it's the population of Elmira or Ithaca or Rome. It's that equivalent, or a third of the population of Albany every year from antibiotic resistant infections. Every year the equivalent of the entire population of Brooklyn gets sick from these infections. What about on a small scale? So I'm going to tell you a story. We'll take a patient, we'll call her Wendy. She's a healthy 8-year-old girl, never taken antibiotics before. Gets brought to her doctor's office saying it hurts when she goes to the bathroom. Doctor takes a urine sample, diagnoses a urinary tract infection. It's a minor problem, right? Many of us have had them or known people who've had them. Doctor reassures the parents, prescribes an oral antibiotic. After a couple of days, though, Wendy is getting sicker. She starts getting fevers and shaking chills. It turns out the E. coli that grows from her urine is resistant to all our oral antibiotics, which is actually something we see all the time now, partly from indiscriminate use in people and partly because of indiscriminate use in animals of antibiotics. I never saw this as a trainee 10 years ago and see it all the time. She's now sicker because this has been going on untreated. She has to get admitted to the hospital, get IV antibiotics, has to get anesthesia to have a long-term IV line placed, go home with home nursing, miss school, miss work. She gets better, gets a workup to figure out why she got a urinary tract infection. Turns out she has an abnormality with her bladder that's actually fairly common. And over the years, the urologist she sees tries to do some things to fix it, doesn't get fully fixed. So she keeps getting UTIs. Every time we treat one, it gets a little bit more resistant, the bacteria that causes it, the next time. And every time we treat one, because of that, the infection is just a little bit worse, just a little bit more severe, as we treat it just a little bit longer, a little bit more dangerous. Finally, now she's, we'll say 15, comes into the hospital in shock, she's septic. She started on the same antibiotics she got the last time she had a urinary tract infection, but those don't work. So I'm called once they get the culture back because they want to know what to treat her with. And I'm the specialist, right? I'm supposed to know these things. But I don't have one. I will never have an antibiotic that I can offer her because her bacteria is resistant to every single antibiotic that we have. Her infection is untreatable. And so Wendy, the next day or the day after, scared, delirious, in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines, dies of a UTI that we could not treat. This is not a hypothetical. I've obviously changed details, but this is representative of the most recent time that I have had to tell parents that we have no antibiotics left to offer their son or daughter, and it will certainly not be the last. I went into ID because these are treatable things. We give someone pills or IV and they walk out of the hospital healthy. I did not go into ID and have to tell people we don't have antibiotics to treat a urine infection. What else must we then tell our patients we can't offer them? Most of modern medicine actually now becomes impossible if we have resistant infections more common than this. Nearly every surgery will carry an absurdly high risk of death from a post-op infection. Think about deaths from tonsillectomies or appendectomies. I mean, it sounds wild, but it could totally be there in just a few years. Forget about hip replacements, open heart surgeries, anything like that. Organ transplants, anything you have to immunosuppress somebody to do, goes out the window. Treatment of cancer, where you're immunosuppressing them, also out the window. The list goes on. The only way to prevent this, to keep our antibiotics working, is to slow the rate of resistance. We cannot keep breeding these superbugs, and the only way to do that is to use less antibiotics everywhere they are used, including in animals. We know that the antibiotics we give animals wind up through their waste in soil and water, contributing to the resistance of all the bacteria in our environment, many of which are species that then infect us, not to mention the bacteria the animals then carry, which people can get infected with, and there's a whole body of research on that you may hear some about. So those 2.8 million infections, you heard this 20% number, the 20% of the resistant bacteria are from antibiotics in animals. Just to put that again back in perspective, about 600,000 people, so the equivalent of maybe the population of Buffalo, Rochester, and Syracuse combined is related to animal antibiotic use. This bill is the perfect way for New York, which is a state that has always been a leader in healthcare, as evidenced by the new proposal about requiring hospitals to have stewardship programs, as well as so many other fields, to continue to lead by making sure that antibiotic use in animals is as judicious as possible so that my patients, my family, and all of our state's families will have those antibiotics available for years to come. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to try to shout over the shouters downstairs. I'm just going to pretend they're celebrating me. My name is Lance Price. I'm a PhD researcher. I run the Antibiotic Resistance Action Center at George Washington University and the School of Public Health. We do molecular microbiology, we do communications, and we do policy work, all to preserve the utility of antibiotics for future generations. And so I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. So you've just heard about the challenges that we have in human medicine today. Kids dying of infections that were once easily treatable. You know, urinary tract infections are going from a painful annoyance to a deadly infection because without antibiotics, they ascend from the bladder into the kidney and then get into the blood where they can kill us. And of course, a lot of the resistance, a lot of the superbugs that we're dealing with is due to overuse of antibiotics in human medicine. There's no doubt about it. Medicine, in some cases, urgent care, think about urgent care today, is almost like a service industry, right? So people come in expecting a service. The doctors are afraid of one-star reviews and they're writing prescriptions like crazy. That's part of the fuel of this fire. But the other part of the fuel is the millions of pounds of antibiotics that we're using in animal production each year in the United States. And actually around the world, because we've designed a model that we've exported around the world. And so my research shows, and my research and that research of many of others, shows that the millions of pounds of antibiotics that we use in animal production leads to drug-resistant bacteria that spread to people. So let me tell you what happens when we feed animals antibiotics, when we give it to them in their water, even when we inject it into them, it penetrates the tissues of that animal, spills into the guts of those animals, and puts pressure on the trillions of bacteria that live in and on those animals. When we slaughter those animals to make meat, we inevitably contaminate some of that meat with those drug-resistant bacteria. And then we go to the grocery store thinking we're in America, we have a safe food supply. We're buying these packages of meat contaminated with these living, infectious, drug-resistant bacteria that we can then bring into our house and share with our family. And you'll hear from some of my colleagues from Consumers Union about how riddled our food supply is with these drug-resistant bacteria. We also spill these bacteria into the environment because we raise 9 billion with a B, food animals, food production animals in the United States each year. That's where we get our meat. That's great. But when we give them antibiotics, we're forcing the evolution of these drug-resistant bacteria in the guts of these animals. Well, what do we do with the feces of those animals? We use it as fertilizer, right? So we're spreading these drug-resistant bacteria into the environment. They can contaminate our waterways, our plants, and then we can ingest them that way as well. So that's a big problem. So some of the bacteria that we're leading to the evolution of are things like Salmonella, Campylobacter. So Salmonella you've all heard of, right? Diarrhea. Campylobacter causes just about as many cases of diarrhea. You've got E. coli and you've got Staph aureus. So these bacteria can cause the traditional foodborne infections, diarrhea, vomiting, etc. But we can also, now we see evidence that a substantial fraction of UTIs, urinary tract infections, are coming from the E. coli that started off in animals, largely in poultry. And so they become resistant to the drugs that they use in the poultry. And then when we go to treat those infections in people, that treatment can fail. So that ascent from the bladder to the kidney to the blood can happen because of the drugs we use in animals. And that's because, you heard about this earlier, we're using the same drugs in animals as we use in human medicine. So we're leading to the evolution of bacteria that are resistant to the very treatments that we would use in the hospitals. This is a ridiculous abuse of life-saving medicines when they're being used for routine disease prevention, which is what this bill will stop. Right? We used to feed them to animals to make them grow faster. I mean, we were using them like cheap production tools. So we're crashing up against this crisis, and meanwhile we're allowing large food-producing industries to use antibiotics like production tools. So I think, if you think about the way we overuse antibiotics in animals and the way we overuse antibiotics in human medicine, they work synergistically. Both of these fuel this fire, and we can't solve the problem by just focusing on one thing. It's like a game of whack-a-mole, right? That's just going to pop up the other side. So we can't point fingers. We have to all accept our responsibility. So food, animal production, medicine, and we have to curb unnecessary antibiotic use and work together to do this. So that's why I was really happy to get this invitation, because the leadership that I'm seeing from you two is it's what we need at the national level and what we don't have at the national level. And so New York is taking the steps, hopefully taking the steps, to protect their people, but also lead the way for the nation to protect all of us against these drug-resistant bacteria and against really the flagrant abuse of antibiotics in food animal production. So thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, my name's Dr. Michael Hansen. I'm a senior scientist, also a PhD at Consumer Reports. And we do a lot of product testing. And I should first say, as others have pointed out, medically important antibiotics are used in both humans and animals. And in fact, 2/3 of all the medically important antibiotics used in the U.S. go into animal production, not into humans. And Consumer Reports studies over the past 10 years, including ground beef, chicken, ground turkey, and shrimp, clearly show that there are a lot of disease-causing organisms that are in our food supply. A significant proportion of those pathogens are superbugs, and those are defined as bacteria that are resistant to 3 or more classes of antibiotics. Thus, in our testing, 14% of ground beef samples, 14% of shrimp, 83% of ground turkey, and 57% of chicken samples were contaminated with superbugs. It turns out that production methods that don't use antibiotics, such as no antibiotic labels, organic or grass-fed, actually were less likely to contain superbugs compared to conventional production methods. So for example, conventionally produced ground beef was twice as likely to contain superbugs as sustainably produced, and it was 3 times as likely to contain superbugs as grass-fed. So the ground beef, 18% had superbugs. The sustainably produced was 9%. The grass-fed was 6%. So clearly the way you produce animals has a big impact on not only the bacteria that are there, but how many are resistant to a number of bacteria. I'd also point out we did 2 years ago in 2018, we did a nationally representative survey and found that 78% of the respondents agreed that meat producers should stop giving antibiotics to animals that aren't sick, and that 57% agreed that they would be more likely to eat at a restaurant that served meat raised without antibiotics. So from our own testing, we're finding there's a problem with food, and this bill would actually attack that problem to make sure that medically important antibiotics are only used to treat or control diseases and not to prevent them. So this should, and there's a reporting requirement, so this will allow us to see, if this bill goes in, that the level of antibiotic use decreases in agriculture, and that will lead to lower levels of superbugs in our foods.
Hi, my name is Jean Halloran, and I'm with Center for Food Safety, which is a national organization. We have 30,000 members here in New York. I've been very involved with something called the Chain Reaction Report, where we've looked at the big fast food chains and what are their policies on whether their meat and poultry comes from antibiotics. And what's really interesting is that those chains have been gradually moving towards no antibiotics inputs. McDonald's has really started a new program to move their beef supply to no antibiotics. This is just in the early stages, but I mean, we support this bill because it's better for food safety and better for preserving antibiotics. But this bill can also potentially position producers in New York State to be at the leading edge of this new trend for consumer preference and fast food chain preference to have meat and poultry raised without antibiotics. Thank you.
We've been joined by our colleague, Assemblymember Joanne Simon.
Thank you. I don't have much to add to this wonderful, detailed presentation about why this is really a concern. I mean, it seems to me, just from listening to the conversation, that we are now using antibiotics kind of to just ward off evil spirits. And the problem is we're encouraging the evil spirits. We're growing the evil spirits. And I'm not like one of those people. But really, that's exactly what the science is. There's no science. It's really being used allegedly as to prevent disease, but in fact it's encouraging the spread of disease because we won't be able to treat the diseases we actually have. So it's something I'm very concerned about, and I'm really glad to see that my colleagues have introduced this bill. Hopefully we'll be able to make some headway because it's clearly very, very important to everyone here in America, and I'm sure it's actually a worldwide problem. And if New York can take a lead on this, so much the better. We can make a real difference. Thank you.
And we're also joined by Assemblymember Harvey Epstein from Manhattan.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator and Assemblywoman, for moving this issue forward. It's really important to think about what antibiotics are doing, not just to our animals, but to our society. And the use or the overuse is a real concern. I think the science is really important for us to look at and to be really concerned about its use prophylactically and what the implications are for animals and people around the world. So I really applaud your leadership here and thank you for moving this issue forward. I'm happy to stand with you today. Thank you both.
All right, so anybody have any questions?
Have you had any conversations with the second floor about getting this new budget?
No, not yet.
No, not yet.
And so the executive has proposed language with respect to human health, to the healthcare system, but it would be in addition. We could obviously do it theoretically through the budget if we're doing something in this issue, or we've had this piece of standalone legislation that we're intending to push forward as well. So either, from my perspective, either way would be appropriate to get it done.
But I think you guys had a similar news conference on this issue last year. The bill obviously didn't move. So what's sort of been the holdup on it?
The sponsor was Janie Romeo, so I'm now the sponsor, so maybe
we're having ongoing conversation. I mean, this is a bill that affects the agricultural industry, which is, just we recognize both its significance statewide and also our commitment to making sure that our farmers, we think it's a good thing that we're producing the food we need for New Yorkers within New York State. So we're hearing from people in the industry, and also the bill directly addresses the way that the veterinarians work with farms. So we're having ongoing conversations with the people who will be affected by this bill. But we're taking feedback and we're intending to move it forward.
So are farmers in the ag industry not on board with this?
I don't think I think that opinions within the agricultural community vary. We do have some farmers who have said they favor the bill, and also some people within, in all aspects of the industry. But again, it's a robust set of regulations. There are reporting requirements, all kinds of elements of the bill. We want to make sure we get it right. So I don't think you've seen the Farm Bureau coming out in favor of this at this point, but we are having conversations with all parties to make sure we get something that will be effective and that will work for the people that have to do the work in the field.
And it's also change is hard, and people have been using this practice for years, but it seems to me this is an existential problem. And it's not confined to this state or this country, it's a worldwide problem, and so it's urgent that we deal with it.
What is your definition of antimicrobial?
Well, there's actually a technical answer to that, which is in the bill, like antimicrobial agents.
It's not.
Okay, there's not a...
Yeah, it's basically any compound that kills or restricts microbes. So those can be bacteria, they can be fungi, they can be a range of things.
So by that stretch, that means that antimicrobials can consider dewormers, which we use in our dogs and cats, that can consider antifungals, antiparasitics, antiprotozoals, when really you're just attacking antibiotics, and I think that's
Well, those are all, look, part of the reason that this language is used here is that's what the technical agencies use, and that's also what's used globally. Most of the focus is on antibiotics, is on bacteria. Part of the reason that they include the other microbes is because the resistance elements sometimes can move between. So resistance to a fungal pathogen can also select for resistance to a bacterial pathogen. But I think most of what's being focused on here and most of the reporting is going to be on the medically important antibiotics, because this bill is restricted to medically important, right? So if it's something that is just being used in animals or for companion animals, it isn't going to be in this unless it's medically important. So for example, all of the coccidiostats, right, they're not included, even though they do have antibacterial activity.
Anyone else?
I'll just add in, I mean, there are problems with antimicrobial resistance for fungi. Candida auris, people have probably heard about, as a new species of yeast that's resistant to a lot of antifungal drugs. There can be resistance to antivirals, and but it is, as others have said, the bill really focuses on the preventative use in animal agriculture, and so it's, no one's trying to say you can't treat a sick cat, let alone a sick cow. Certainly, and again, a lot of those drugs that we use in animals are not the same agents we use in people, especially for house pets and things like that.
Can you describe the specific medicines and SOPs that are used in preventative antibiotic use in animal production? Because you're saying an umbrella that this is being done. What is the specifics? What are the specific antibiotics? How are they using it? What species?
So, I mean, one example would be shipping fever. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of what we call production diseases. So shipping fever. So you load cattle up into a truck 2 layers high. You ship them for hundreds of miles to the feedlot, and on the way they get sick, right? So if you crammed people together, not wearing underwear, they're going to share microbes. They're going to get stressed out. They're going to get sick. And so they get something called shipping fever, and so they give them antibiotics for that. So liver abscesses, when you switch cattle from grass to soybeans and corn, rich supplemented feed, they're going to get liver abscesses because they weren't evolved to eat that. So then they give them preventative antibiotics for that as well. So those are just some examples. You can also have, so then there's also gentamicin injections into chicks and eggs. So we have pallets of eggs, huge pallets of eggs that go into hatcheries, right? So you have, those are the chickens that we eat for breakfast, not the eggs that we eat for breakfast, but the chickens that become, meat. We have huge pallets of eggs that go into hatcheries. To prevent infections, we inject vaccines, which I'm in favor of, but they also will try to prevent bacterial infections by injecting gentamicin into the chicken egg as well. Well, that leads to gentamicin-resistant bacteria in the animals, leads to gentamicin-resistant bacteria that can then spread to people. We used to allow cephalosporins, one of our most important antibiotics, to be used in that in ovo injection in eggs, and that very clearly led to cephalosporin-resistant salmonella in chicken products. When it was finally banned in Canada, what we saw, and Quebec, actually one section of Canada, when they stopped injecting those chicken eggs with cephalosporins, we saw cephalosporin-resistant salmonella plummet on chicken products. We also saw cephalosporin-resistant salmonella in people, infections in people plummet. So you can have a direct positive impact on human health by withdrawing these routine preventative uses of antibiotics.
So in New York State, when cattle are transported from farm to, let's say, not a slaughterhouse, but an auction barn, they're not normally being sold on large potbelly trailers of what you're talking about, the double deckers. But essentially,
So see if there's any reporters have any questions, and we can obviously talk to people. Anybody else? All right, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.